I called him a midget in front of his fraternity brothers, and then he did this. I never thought calling my husband a midget in front of his fraternity brothers would change my life, but here I am sitting alone in my house, staring at a pile of divorce papers. If you had told me a few months ago that a stupid joke would mess up everything, I'd have laughed it off. After all, I've known my husband Mark for many years. We met in our late 20s, and at first, he was everything I thought I wanted. Steady, reliable, someone who would always be there. But I guess I never thought about how much quiet could eventually drive me crazy. We had our issues, sure, who doesn't? But nothing that ever seemed serious enough to tear us apart. The little things like how he could never seem to keep up with me socially, or how he'd always be the last one to crack a joke. I never meant to hurt him. It was just one of those moments where you think you're being playful, but you go too far. And yet the second I said it right there, in front of his frat buddies, I knew it was a mistake. I saw the way his face dropped, the way the room suddenly went silent, and a part of me hoped it wasn't as bad as it felt. But I could tell by the way he looked at me that something had shifted. That was the moment everything changed. Now I'm here, alone, regretting every word. As I stand here today, I never thought that I would be with a man like Mark. I've always thought I would end up with someone who is a little different, you know. I don't know, it's exciting, a guy who would be fun, the type that would make me laugh, take me out of my comfort zone, if you know what I mean. However, when I got to know Mark, there were more grim expectations than anything else. In fact, I was not actively seeking it, love that is. I was just coming out of less than the best of relationships. I was still looking for something steady, and he was just a decent guy, no frills. We met at a mutual friend's party one evening. I remember I was standing near the kitchen, half listening to a conversation about the latest Netflix show everyone was obsessed with, when I noticed him standing by the door. He was one of those guys who didn't quite fit in with the crowd, not in a bad way, but in a I don't need to try too hard way. He wasn't the loudest or the funniest, but there was something about him. He looked a little out of place, but in a way that made me want to know more. And when we started talking, I realized we had a lot in common. He wasn't trying to impress me, which, oddly enough, was refreshing. He was everything that I never thought I wanted in a man. But there was something about him being so quiet that was reassuring. Looking at them, I realized that I was coming off a series of relatively disruptive relationships, so the thought of being with someone who was relatively low-key seemed kind of perfect at that time, and it worked, for a while. We got comfortable, I with my career, him with his own job that paid the bills but was nothing to write home about. He was steady. He wasn't interested in getting a promotion. He wasn't seeing himself being a millionaire. All that mattered to him is to come and perform his duties. That steadiness, though, was exactly what I needed at first. My career had been taking off, and I was moving in circles with people who were all about growth, ambition, and success. But Mark didn't care about any of that. He was a good guy, simple in the best way. He wasn't obsessed with appearances or fitting into a mold. I loved that about him at first. But as the months went by, I started to notice little things that started to eat at me. First of all, he was not a model of energetic initiative. I'd get up, go to work, achieve new levels, be given a raise, and come home to him sitting on a chair recounting his day like he isn't trying at all to better himself. He was satisfied with what he could get, and that's perfectly fine for some, but I needed more. It's not like I didn't notice that I was giving up a lot of my independence for the security that he was willing to provide. I mean, I was living the dream, and he was either indoors gaming or watching videos of what seemed to be him moving backward. And then there was the other thing, the way people reacted to him. Mark wasn't exactly someone who commanded a room. He was a little shorter than most of the guys I'd been around, and while he was good-looking in his own way, he didn't have that confidence I'd always found so appealing in other men. Sometimes I'd be out with him and feel like I was the one carrying the conversation, like I was doing all the work to make things feel fun or interesting. It wasn't that he was shy, he just didn't have that social swagger that made me feel proud to have him by my side. Of course, I loved him. I want to make that clear. I really did. But there were moments, of course, when we went out with friends or family and I sat there comparing him with my previous boyfriends who were rough, the kind of men who gave one the feeling that they are capable of handling anything. Mark wasn't like that. He was just Mark. And at first I told myself that was okay with me because it was the truth and nobody would judge me for that. But after a while, those little things, the lack of ambition, the way he sometimes shrank into himself began to resentment. I don't know if it was a need for excitement or a fear of missing out, but I started wondering if I was settling. I felt like I was on this fast track in life, chasing success and social status, and he was content to just watch it all pass by. Sometimes I found myself resenting the very things I once loved about him, how he didn't need to impress anyone, how he didn't care what people thought, and that's when the cracks in our relationship started to show. Then I'd glance at him, the man, dressed in a t-shirt and jeans, comfortably seated on the couch as if the world belongs to him, and I'd feel annoyed. Perhaps that is why, when we were out with his fraternity brothers one night, I told a joke. I didn't plan for it to be that important. It was just a joke. But subconsciously, perhaps, I think I knew it was something I was doing out of the way of getting his reactions to something no matter what it was. Looking back, maybe I should have just talked to him. But instead, I kept my frustrations inside, building up until I let them slip in front of the one group of people where I knew it had hit hardest. It was a Saturday night, and Mark and I had been invited to a get-together with his fraternity brothers. I didn't want to go. I'd been feeling off for weeks, and spending time with a group of guys who were the complete opposite of him, loud, confident, always cracking jokes, wasn't helping my mood. But Mark insisted, as he always did. He loved these nights where he could just kick back and reminisce about his college days. I figured it would be fine, just a few hours of awkward small talk, then I'd be back to my own space. We arrived and I knew straight away it was different. There was a free-flowing energy, and yet underlying tension I could not quite discern. His friends were occupying the living room, and many of them were in the middle of conversation or card games. They were exactly what I had expected. Boisterous, vulgar, and full of tales of the neighboring, older and evidently more successful public houses. These guys were not only confident, they bordered on arrogance. They were the masters of the house without anyone having to force them. They were not flaunting at all, but there was this undercurrent that could not be denied for existing. And then there was Mark. He was standing in the corner, fiddling with his drink, trying to join in, but clearly out of his element. He wasn't shy, but he wasn't jumping into the conversation either. He wasn't wearing the same kind of confidence I saw in these guys, and for a moment I couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Here he was, the guy I had chosen to spend my life with, and he couldn't seem to hold his own in a room full of men who were honestly just a little too much. I hated the thoughts I had, but the rising question arises that it is impossible not to compare him to the others. They were all lanky. You could say that they looked more authoritative than Mark, who didn't possess this innate charm. He was, well, smaller. He was not exactly a short man, but standing next to these guys, one could not even tell he was anything out of the ordinary. But most of all, I despised the fact that I did care in the first place. But there it was. We were all sitting around the coffee table, the guys cracking jokes and Mark chuckling along with them. I tried to get into the conversation, but I could tell my mind wasn't in it. Every laugh felt like it pushed me further away. I watched them, thinking to myself, why can't he be more like that? Why can't he just step up? That's when I said it. One of his friends, Brett, said something ludicrous about how Mark had once lost a race to him in college. We all laughed, and for some reason I was becoming so frustrated for some reasons I cannot explain. I stretched forward to tell Mark, hoping to crack a joke which will make everyone cheer up. However, it was a moment before my next words came out of my mouth. Well, I guess you are the midget of the group, huh? The words hit the air before I could even take them back, and as soon as I said them, the room went quiet. I don't even know what I was thinking at the time. It was a joke, sure, but it was cruel. Mark froze. His face drew into a scowl, and for a brief moment I got lost in the abyss of his irises. Shock? Hurt? A little bit of both? He forced a chuckle, but the anxiety was clearly present in the pitch of his voice. Yeah, I guess I am, he said, forcing a smile. The others, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, laughed awkwardly. They didn't know how to react, so they just kept going, the sound of their laughter filling the space. But it wasn't the same. The energy had changed. I could tell Mark was holding back, trying to keep the mood light, but it wasn't working. And then for a moment we were alone, and surrounded by a wave of uncomfortable silence that engulfed our little capsule. All the others went on discussing what they wanted. All of a sudden I became conscious of the expression which Mark had on his face. He didn't get mad, no, he was just frustrated. There was exposure I could not help to take notice of or find a way to contain in some ways. It was as if I had hit him hard in the stomach, only without being aware of it at all. I could feel the weight of what I'd just done. At the moment, it was like a weird power trip, like I could control the room by throwing out something that would make him feel small. But then it hit me. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to make him feel less than, especially in front of his friends. But the damage was done. The moment had passed, and now it was too late to take it back. The remaining part of night became a blur to me. Unfortunately, I attempted to apologize, though the words did not sound quite right. He dismissed it as he normally did. Mark was not a man who could cause a scene, but I could see that things had changed. It was as if every word I said from that point was completely unconvincing. And a new struggle began between us, which was only growing with the minutes, and when we left, I realized that it was no longer the same. However, as is often the case, it is only much later that you can truly understand how much you have only urged yourselves into a situation from which there can be no return. After that night, things between Mark and I felt off. At first, I thought it was just a temporary thing that would blow over after a couple of days, but it didn't. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and every day it seemed to get heavier. The first thing that I observed was how aloof he got. Mark was always a pretty timid boy, and now, even if we were in the same room, it was as if the distance between us was much greater. But it wasn't just for intimacy through which that did take a major hit, but also for other aspects of lovemaking, such as when he arrives from work without a simple greeting to me. Sometimes he would get up and go directly to the kitchen or his office, and then I was just left sitting there, not knowing what to speak about next. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way I expected. There were no outbursts or slammed doors. Instead, it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that makes you question everything but without a word being said. He didn't raise his voice, didn't confront me directly, but he didn't look at me the same way anymore. His eyes didn't soften when he saw me. Instead, there was this guardedness, like he was bracing for something. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But it wasn't. I could feel the rift growing between us, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to rationalize it in my head. It was just a joke, I kept telling myself. He'll get over it. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more I saw how much it affected him. His reactions were subtle, but they were there. One night, we were sitting on the couch watching TV, and I made a passing comment about a friend of mine. I don't even remember what I said, but Mark barely looked up from his phone and just muttered, "Sounds nice." It wasn't just the lack of engagement, it was the tone. The flatness in his voice, the disinterest, like he didn't care anymore. The feeling of being invisible when I was right next to him was worse than any fight we'd ever had. It started to feel like everything I did irritated him. I'd ask him if he wanted to grab dinner and he'd say, "Yeah, sure, whatever," in this way that made it clear he didn't really care. Or I'd try to make small talk, and he'd respond with short, clipped answers. He wasn't snapping at me, but his indifference was starting to get under my skin. One day, I caught him staring at me for a second longer than usual. It wasn't a look of affection, though. It was like he was studying me, almost as if he was wondering why he was still here. It made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. It felt like he was seeing something in me that I didn't want him to see. The more I tried to push him to talk about what was going on, the more he withdrew. I'd apologize for what I said, but it never seemed to land. I'd tell him I didn't mean it, that I didn't want to hurt him. He'd nod, but his eyes never really met mine. It was like he didn't trust me enough to be open, like I had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed with words. We started having these awkward silences at night. I'd lie in bed next to him, and while his back was turned towards me, I could feel the space between us widening. I'd reach out for him, just to hold his hand, but he'd pull away or turn over, pretending to be asleep. The distance didn't just feel physical, it was emotional. We used to fall asleep talking about our day, laughing about stupid things. Now it was like we were strangers in the same bed. I knew I'd messed up. I regretted it more than I could say, but I didn't know how to fix it. The words felt stuck in my throat every time I tried to apologize again. I could see how hurt he was, but it wasn't the kind of hurt you can fix with a quick, "I'm sorry." It was deeper than that, and that realization scared me. The worst part was how I started to feel, like I had messed up something irreparably, and I didn't know how to get back to where we were before. The guilt gnawed at me, but instead of getting closer to him, I started pulling away myself. It wasn't even a conscious decision, it just happened. I stopped trying so hard to fix things because every time I did, I felt more rejected. At the same time, I started seeking validation from other places. It wasn't intentional at first, but I couldn't help it. The emptiness between Mark and I made me crave attention from other people. It started innocently enough with compliments here and there, friendly chats with coworkers, but the more I felt neglected at home, the more I sought out those little boosts of reassurance. One evening, I found myself texting an old acquaintance from work, someone I'd been friendly with in the past. He was kind, charming, and easy to talk to, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. The conversation started off innocent enough, but there was a part of me that couldn't help but wonder, what if? What if this person could give me the attention I wasn't getting at home? What if this was the fix I needed? But deep down, I knew it wasn't the solution. I knew I was digging myself into a deeper hole. And still, I kept texting, kept seeking that validation, because the coldness between Mark and I made it impossible to stop. The more I distanced myself from Mark, the more I felt the weight of what I had done. I couldn't ignore the damage, and as the days passed, it felt like there was no way back from this. I had broken something I couldn't fix, and the worst part was, I didn't know if I even deserved to. It wasn't long after everything went downhill that I started to drift away from Mark, both physically and emotionally. The weight of the silence between us, the coldness, it just became too much. I found myself looking for distractions to fill the void that had opened up in our relationship. It wasn't like I planned it, but one evening, I ended up at a bar with some friends. Just a casual night out, nothing special. But that night, everything changed. I was sitting at the bar, nursing my drink, my mind wandering back to all the things Mark and I hadn't said to each other. I could feel the frustration building in me, like a pressure that just wouldn't release. My friends were talking about their lives, but my thoughts kept drifting to the mess I'd made of my own. And then he appeared. A man, mid-30s, good-looking in that effortless way. He wasn't my type at first glance, but there was something about him, his confidence, the way he carried himself that caught my attention. He smiled, we exchanged pleasantries, and before I knew it, we were talking. At first, it was small talk, basic questions about work, life, all the usual stuff. But as the night wore on, something shifted. I found myself drawn into the conversation more and more. He wasn't like Mark. He was confident in a way Mark wasn't, a little sharper, a little more charming. And with every word, I couldn't help but compare him to my husband. Where Mark had grown distant, this man was engaged, present. I realized somewhere deep inside I was craving the attention I hadn't gotten from Mark in months. I told myself it was harmless. It was just a conversation. But it wasn't. I started to flirt. Just a little. I let the boundaries blur, let the attraction build up. As the night wore on, it didn't take much for him to lean in closer, for his hand to brush mine, for the conversation to take on a more intimate tone. He wasn't just listening to me, he was seeing me in a way Mark hadn't in so long, and the longer we talked, the more the guilt started to fade into the background. I justified it to myself. Mark had pulled away. He wasn't there for me. He was cold, distant, and I was just looking for someone who cared. That thought kept running through my head. I deserved this. I deserved to feel wanted. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about being desired. It was about someone looking at me and actually seeing me. It was about feeling understood. It was about filling the hole that had opened up between Mark and me. And somewhere along the way, I allowed myself to believe that what I was doing was okay. Eventually, we left the bar together. He offered to drive me home, and I agreed. I had no real intention of going back to my apartment alone, not when he was offering to make me feel alive again. At some point during the drive, things escalated. It wasn't even that I was trying to make it happen. It just did. One thing led to another, and before I could stop it, we were in his apartment. I don't even remember the details clearly. I just remember the feeling of doing something I knew I shouldn't. The guilt was there, thick and suffocating, but it didn't stop me. It was like I needed this moment, this release, to remind myself that I was still desirable, that I wasn't just the wife who was being ignored. I told myself I was justified, but deep down I knew the truth. I was betraying Mark. I was betraying everything we'd built. Afterwards, I sat there staring at the wall, the weight of what I'd just done crashing down on me. The guilt came back in full force. I had crossed a line, and I couldn't take it back. I had allowed myself to be vulnerable in the wrong way, and as much as I wanted to believe this was just a mistake, a one-time thing, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just about one night. It was about everything that had built up between Mark and me. The distance, the silence, the coldness. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just angry with him. I was angry with myself for letting things get this far. The next morning, I didn't know how to face Mark. I couldn't even bring myself to call him, let alone look him in the eye. I knew I had to come clean, but part of me wanted to hide from it, pretend it never happened. I didn't want to lose him, but I knew I already had. And then he found out. I had just stepped out of the shower when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it, my stomach sinking as I read the words. It was a picture of me, blurry, taken the night before in the bar, with the man I had been talking to. It was enough to make my heart stop. A message followed. You might want to tell your husband the truth. I don't think he's going to be happy when he finds out. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I dropped the phone on the counter. How did he know? Who was this person? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I barely had time to process the message before I heard the front door open. Mark walked in, his face tight, his eyes searching for me. He didn't say a word at first, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. I knew it wasn't just about the picture. It was everything that had led up to it, the silence, the distance, the growing distance between us that had finally broken us. Who was that last night? He asked, his voice low, controlled, but I could see the anger beneath the surface. I froze, every part of me screaming to deny it, to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I don't know what you mean, I said, my voice shaky. But he didn't buy it. He'd already seen enough. His eyes narrowed and I saw the hurt in them. You really think I wouldn't find out? You really think I wouldn't notice? His voice was cold, the words cutting deeper than anything he could have shouted. You think this is some mistake? That this is just me overreacting? I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. The silence stretched between us like an unbearable weight, and for the first time I realized what I'd done. I had destroyed everything, and I didn't know how to fix it. The moment Mark said those words, "This is over," I felt my entire world crack. Everything we had, everything I thought was secure, just shattered right in front of me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the cold finality in his voice. He wasn't angry, not the way I expected. He was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the weight of his words hit harder. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't a fight we could come back from. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at me. His eyes weren't filled with rage. There was no shouting, no throwing things. It was worse. He was done. The hurt in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. It was like I had torn down everything he believed in, every promise we made. I had broken him. "I trusted you," he said, his voice calm but shaking. "I trusted you with everything, and you just threw it away. For what? For a momentary escape?" I couldn't look him in the eye. I wanted to explain, to make him understand how lost I had felt, how distant we'd become. But the words wouldn't come, and even if they did, I knew it was too late. Nothing I said could fix what I'd done. "Get it? I never thought you were the type of person who could do this," he continued. "But now, I see I was wrong. I can't do this anymore. I can't look at you the same way." I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but something in his face told me it was pointless. He had already made up his mind. His decision was final. "I'm leaving," he said, turning toward the door without another word. "I'm done." As he walked out, the silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words settled over me. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. I had been expecting a fight, maybe even tears. But this quiet, resolute departure was the hardest thing of all. He wasn't angry. He was just gone. I tried calling him, texting him, anything to get him to listen. "I'm sorry," I wrote over and over. "Please, let's talk. I made a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But he never replied. Not once. Days passed, and the silence between us grew. I kept expecting him to come back, to walk through the door and tell me everything would be okay. But he didn't. He was gone, and it was my fault. The weight of everything I'd done hit me harder than I ever imagined. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was the years of neglect, the little things I had overlooked. The cracks in our marriage had been there long before the comment, long before I made the mistake of seeking validation elsewhere. But it wasn't until that moment when Mark walked out the door that I realized how deep I had let things sink. I spent my days replaying everything in my mind. What could I have done differently? What if I had just been patient? What if I had tried harder to fix things instead of tearing them apart? But it didn't matter now. The truth was, I had lost him, and in a way, I had lost myself too. In the end, the consequences of my actions weren't just about the affair. They were about the trust I had broken, the relationship I had ruined, and the life I thought we would have. And now I was alone. Update. It's strange, the way time seems to warp when you've lost something important. The days that followed the fallout were blurry, each one feeling like it dragged on longer than the last. I kept thinking maybe things would go back to normal, that maybe I could fix it, but deep down I knew I couldn't. I had made my bed, and now I was lying in it. Looking back, I realized how foolish I was, not just for the things I said, but for the things I didn't say. I let my frustrations, my insecurities, and my need for validation drive me to hurt the one person who had never done anything but try to make me feel loved. I could have been patient. I could have communicated better. But instead, I lashed out. I made a joke at his expense, and I thought it was harmless. But that moment, that one careless word changed everything. And I can't undo it. What stings the most is knowing how little I appreciated what I had until it was gone. Mark wasn't perfect, but he was a good man. He was steady, kind, and when things got tough, he was there. I didn't realize how much I took that for granted until I no longer had it. I kept thinking there was something better out there, something more exciting, more fulfilling. But all I ended up with was a gaping hole where my marriage used to be. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself that I'll be okay. I tell myself that I deserve this, that I have to learn from my mistakes. But some days, it feels like the regret is all I have left. Mark is moving on. I've heard through mutual friends that he's seeing someone new. It stings, but it's the least he deserves. He deserves someone who can appreciate him, someone who won't take him for granted. As for me, I'm left with the consequences of my actions, alone, trying to piece together a life that makes sense after everything has fallen apart. I keep asking myself why I did it. Why I let my need for attention and validation lead me down a path I couldn't turn back from. It's a painful lesson, but one I'll carry with me forever. In the end, I got what I wanted: attention, excitement, a fleeting sense of validation. But what I didn't realize was that it wasn't worth losing everything I had. I learned the hard way that chasing after something else, something that wasn't even real, costs you more than you're willing to pay. And now, all I have left is the bitter taste of regret and the knowledge that I brought this all on myself.